Welcome to the series on Salesforce flows. Today, we will learn about what is a record trigger flows. Before jumping into the actual topic, let us understand what we have discussed earlier. In the earlier session, we have understood what is a flow builder. Flow builder is a tool which is used to create flows. We also created a simple flow using a screen flow. Then we understood what are the core elements of flows, like what are the different types of elements that exist and what are the different resources that are part of flow. And lastly, we also saw how to grant access to flows like screen flows and auto launch flows. Like there are various ways like you can grant access to the screen flow. Like at the user level, we can grant the access. At the profile and permission set level, and at the individual level of the flow, we can give the access to the flows. Now, let us understand about the today's session. We'll be going through the introduction of record trigger flow. After that, we will also understand what are the different types of record trigger flow. Then we will see the example related to record trigger flow. Okay, let's see what is a record trigger flow. A record trigger flow gets executed when a record is created, updated, and deleted. That means whenever there is a DML operation on a particular record trigger flows gets triggered. Record trigger flows always runs in a system context. That means irrespective of the user's context, the record trigger flow always runs in the system context. Okay, let's see when the record trigger flows gets fired. It gets fired when a record is created, or when a record is updated, or a record is created or updated, and lastly, a record is deleted. In all these four scenarios, the record trigger flows get fired. To understand more, let's create a simple example and see these details. So I'm in the setup where I've clicked on flows and started creating a new flow. So this is a flow builder which we already saw. Now I'm just starting with start from scratch. Just click on next. Now, instead of selecting screen flows, since the session is related to record trigger flows, let us select record trigger flows. Click on create. Now, the first step in record trigger flow is to identify the object on which the flow is being created or needs to be executed. So let me take an example of a case record. So I'm just selecting an object called case. So this is the object on which the flow will be triggered. As we saw, various scenarios when the flow gets triggered. The first one is a record is created, then a record is updated, then a record is created or updated, or a record is deleted. So these are the four places where a trigger gets fired. Then we have something called entry condition. Like we should always specify whether this particular flow should be fired only when a particular criteria is met. Like if you want to make sure that case record gets fired only when subject is not null. Means when subject is null, false. So when we have this condition, that means whenever a case gets created, if the subject is not null, then this record trigger flow gets fired. Otherwise, this will not be fired. Now let us understand few more options which are given down. Optimize the flow. So what does this mean? To understand this better, let me give you an example of a trigger. In trigger, we have something called before triggers and after triggers. Before triggers are executed, even when the record is saved. That means even when the record is saved, the values are being assigned to the triggering record and it gets executed. And we have something called after triggers. After triggers are when the record is saved and before the committing of the record, the after triggers logic gets executed. In the same way, if you want to have the same scenarios in flows, we have to use these two options. One option is fast field updates, and the other option is actions and related records. So when we are going with before triggers, we have to always use fast field updates. That means This executes when a record is being saved. Even before the record gets saved in the save order execution, the flow gets triggered. But when you select action and related records, that means once the record is saved and before the commit in the save order execution, the flow gets triggered. So now today, let us see about fast field updates. So even before that, we also have another checkbox which tells include a run asynchronous path to access an external system. So let us understand what is this. So we have optimize the flow, the fast field updates. So let us first understand in what all scenarios fast field updates are fired. One is before create, update, and delete, which and it also has this option called execute immediately. So what does this mean? We will see in the next slide. Also, for the action and related records, it's always executed in after create and update, but it is not having any option for delete. So for any delete operations, we cannot use action and related records. So in action and related records, it has three scenarios. One thing is it can be executed immediately, it can be executed asynchronously, and it can execute a scheduled path. So what does that mean? Let's see what is execute immediately. In execute immediately, when a record is fired on a basis of create or update or delete, the flow also gets executed with the record trigger flow, sorry, with the save order execution. That means when a DML operation fires, in the same execution order, the flow also gets executed. That is the meaning of execute immediately. Next, execute asynchronously. In this scenario, first the DML event is executed and then the flow is executed. This means the governor limits are separate for DML execution and the flow execution. But in the first scenario, the governor limits is counted for flow, including the DML event execution, both. And lastly, we also have execute through scheduled paths. Here, the first DML event is executed and there's some time interval. Based on the time interval, it will be waiting for that time interval to execute, to reach, then the flow is executed. So the best example for this is if we would have known about workflows. In workflows, we have something called time-triggered workflows. So time-triggered workflows, the counterpart or the analogy of time-triggered workflow in flows is using scheduled path. Now let's see in action. So since in fast field updates, we have only execute immediately. We don't have other two options. So that's the reason this checkbox is not enabled. But when we select actions and related records, we can see that include a run asynchronous checkbox is enabled. So when I check this, automatically there's a change in the screen elements. One is run immediately, like you want to run immediately some of the actions, then we can add that logic in this place. And you also want to run some actions later point of the time once the normal execution is completed. Then that kind of logic comes into run asynchronously. So we also see something called scheduled path here. So when I click on this, so one logic is related to run immediately, one logic is related to asynchronous, but there is a third logic that is scheduled path. Now, here we can design a scheduled path which I need to run after a time period, like after 3 days or after 1 hour of the actual record is saved, something like that, like the time triggered workflows. So then we need to go with new scheduled path. So these are the different ways like the flow gets executed. One is executes immediately, one asynchronously, one through scheduled path. Now, before understanding or before going into the actual example, let us understand something called global variables in flow. So we have mainly two global variables which are used uh, every time whenever we are working on record trigger flows. One is $record. So this has the data related to the record that launched the flow. Like Whenever I'm creating any DML operation like insertion of a record or deletion of a record or updation of a record, the record data which is triggering the flow has the data in that data is being captured into dollar record. This is something like trigger.new in Apex triggers. Then we also have something called record prior. Normally, in triggers, we have something called trigger.old. So trigger.old is mainly applicable only in update scenarios, right? So similarly, here also, if you want to have the previous record details, like it happens only when there's an update operation. Like in update operation, we have something like the previous record and previous record data and the new data that is getting updated. So the previous record data will be stored in something called record prior, and the new data will be stored in dollar record. So normally this is used whenever you are doing any update operations. So available for update and created or update. So in our flow execution, this record pair is available only when we select something called either record is created or updated or record is scripted. In these two scenarios, we have that option to use dollar record prior. But when you're using record is created, then always we'll have an option to use dollar record. We'll also see few more global variables that are used. Something like we can use label. Like if you want to use the label information that we create in custom labels, then we can go with label. Then we have setup, we have profiles permission, we have API, we have flow, and we have organization. So setup has information about the organization information that we can get it from setup. Then we have profile. So profile data, if you want, you can get it from the profile. Then we have something called API. Then we have flow. Flow will also have something called current date information. Then organization information is being stored in organization variable. Now, let us see the example. So what does the example says? So I just want when a case record is inserted, if case feedback is happy, then I want to give a rating as 5. When it is neutral, then give a rating as 3. And when the feedback is unhappy, then give the rating as 1. Since on the same record, I just want to have these values, I can use before record triggers instead of going with after triggers, right? Let us start on the example. So I'm on a case. I'm just using only when a record is created for now. But this scenario can also be used on record is created or updated because we want to change the feedback from happy to unhappy, then automatically the logic should change. But for now, I'm just showing you the record is created. No, I just want to check before executing this flow logic. I want to make sure that feedback field is not empty. That means this. So this is called some of the global constants that we can use. Like if you want to make sure, if you want to use something for the logical testing, like true or false, then we always use something called global constants, which always have something called true and false. So when you type here true automatically, you'll get that global constant. No need to something use like global. Instead of that, if you just type true, automatically you will get the value. So I want to make sure that this field value is not empty. I'm using false. Then I'm using fast field updates because I don't want to work on after like I want to update even before the record is getting saved, right? So that's the reason I'm just doing this. Now let's start. As we saw in earlier session, we have something called different elements. But if you see, if you refer my previous session and now, we will understand like in the interactions, you're not finding anything. Earlier, we saw something called screen interaction, action interaction, but you see here only one interaction called customer error. You can see logic, like logics are common across all the flows, like screen flows, record trigger flows. So we see those information here. In data also, we are not seeing all the information. We are just seeing either get records, like SOQL kind of a logic we can use, and update records. But we are not seeing anything like create option because we cannot create on before save, right? In before triggers, we cannot create a create record option. We cannot use. So that's the reason these are options are automatically removed when based on the type of flow that we are using. Okay. Now let's start with a decision element. So I just want to check rating. Sorry, check feedback. If feedback is happy, okay. Now this is the condition that we can. As I said, now the use of the global variables comes into picture. Now I just want to use the existing record, and for that we'll be using dollar record. So that is called triggering case. So when you type dollar and R record, automatically you see something called dollar record. And this stores all the fields and its data. So now I just want to check the feedback field. So I have just, for your information, I've just created two fields called feedback, which is a pick list. And I also created one more field called rating, which is a number field. So if feedback equal to happy, similarly, I'll just create two more decisions. Unhappy, dollar record, select the record, feedback equals happy, and something called neutral. Feedback neutral. Okay. And default outcome means if none of the conditions are satisfying, then it'll go to default condition. So next, now as you see automatically, there's a decision path that got created automatically. Now, what I want to do is before assigning it to the actual variable, I just want to assign it to a local variable. So what I'll do, I'll create a new way from the resources. I can create a variable. So I'll just create a variable to store the value, rating value, and it is a number field because I just want to store a rating with 0 decimals. And since it's not a screen flow, we are not using these fields like available for input and output. Now I've created. Now I just want to assign that value based on these conditions. So I have to use assignment operator. So assignment is one of the element, right? So happy rating. Now I have to use that variable called rating value, which is a variable of data type number equals. I'm just giving here the value as 5. Now, the next way is, again, I need to create two more assignments. So instead of that, we can use the flow options. Like we have something called copy. So if we copy it, you can just paste one element. Similarly, I can paste it here also. But make sure that you change the naming. Instead of happy, unhappy. And also remove it, come back and press your tab so that automatically the API name also gets changed. When it's unhappy, I just want to assign it 1. Next, this is neutral. Okay, 3. So I have just assigned. Now, okay, wait, sorry. Now I want to assign to the actual. So once all these values are there and everything is completed, now I want to assign. Again, assign to the triggering record. So assign rating. Okay. Now, what is a triggering record? Again, start with dollar record so that you get the triggering record. In this triggering record, I have something called rating field, case rating equals. Now, instead of having individually, that's the reason I've created a common field variable so that I can use that variable. I'm just assigning this value called rating value. So Done. Let's save this record, save this flow, case feedback rating. Okay. In show advance, you don't have anything because since it's not a screen flow, already whatever the values are there, keep as is and click on save. So this is saved. So before activating, let us do one thing. We'll just click on debug and see how we can debug this flow. So when a debug comes, we can, since it's a create trigger, create record flow, we don't have any options to update, right? So we can just select something called one field, one record you can select. So you can identify any record on your system. So if you see here, I have something called case feedback as happy. Let's select that. This is the case record and click on run. So there is one thing. Always, if you see here, whenever we are using record trigger flows, this checkbox is checked. That means whatever the changes that you do in a debug mode is not saved into the actual record. Now we can see the path, how the path went. So if you see, it started. Start conditions. Start condition is happy is null, false. So the condition is met. So it went to the decision. Now in the decision, it checks whether happy equals to happy. So this is the path, and it went to the assignment, and it is assigned the value as 5 to the temporary variable. And then lastly, it is assigning to the record, the triggering record, and the value is 5. So it got rolled back because, as I showed you, on record trigger flows, always it gets rolled back. So it's working. Let us also check if it's working properly or not by changing this to unhappy. Now debug again. Now give the same record. See, now the flow got changed. So this way you can make sure that your flow is working by testing it. So let's activate. Now let's see by changing. Since I've created on create only, I didn't create the flow on update. So if I change this, it will not get affected. So if you see case, I need to see whether, let me check the rating field. The rating field is here, it's empty. Okay. Yeah. So let's create a new record. I'm just giving mandatory fields. Yeah. I'm just creating happy in case subject. And save. Case origin. Okay. It got created, but where's the field? It's not here. So let me check in the edit. Yeah. Rating got updated to 5. So this is how record trigger flows before record trigger flows execute. So we have seen the demo. So we'll see what are the next steps. So we'll be understanding what is after record trigger flows using an example. Then we'll also look into save order process for the flow, because when a record is saved using any of the DML operation, we have a save order record execution, right? So we should also understand where the flows fit. Okay, thank you for now. We'll meet in the next session.